Hey there, it's Michele Caruana from Play Cafe Academy and Profitable Play. And I'm really excited for today's guest expert because we are talking about one of those topics that is near and dear to my heart, and that is inclusion and accessibility. Now, something that I don't really like to admit that often is it took me about a year into my business journey to really immerse myself into learning more about different disabilities and how to best accommodate them. Now, while I was in the planning process, I did my due diligence. I learned all about the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. I covered all of my bases legally, but that didn't mean, again, I was really immersing myself in educating myself and my team about what it means to be inclusive and accessible. So I'm really excited to bring you today's guest expert. Again, like I said, because I'm really always looking to help you learn from my mistakes, because a lot of the big things we're going to talk about today need to be done in your planning process. However, even if you are already open, there is a ton you can do that is quick, inexpensive, and very easy to implement to make your space more inclusive and more accessible. So this episode kind of touches all of that, and it really opened my eyes, and we give some great real life examples to help you better absorb this information and understand what it actually looks like in the real world in a really practical way. So today my guest expert is Kayla Coburn of Inclusion Starts Now, and she is an inclusion specialist and educational consultant. And while she normally works with individuals and school districts, this conversation really translates all of that into a business conversation. And today we're going to talk about what we can do as indoor playground owners to make our spaces more accessible and inclusive, and how we can really foster those values, and how we can learn more about the communities that we seek to serve. I've linked all of Kayla's information, her social media accounts, her website, and all that good stuff in the video description if you want to continue learning more. I talk about this in this video, but I love following Kayla. She gives me so many practical tips, both as a parent of a child with a disability and as a business owner. So without further ado, here is Kayla Coburn of Inclusion Starts Now. Hi, Kayla. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So do you want to get started by giving us a little introduction and some information on your background before we kind of dive into your area of expertise?
Yeah, so I'm Kayla. I used to be a paraprofessional, a special education teacher, and I've kind of just worked all over the education field. And it has always been in the area of extensive support needs. And that has just kind of always been something I was gravitating to. But I had a really hard time working with districts because I was always really frustrated as an employee trying to just make change and getting my students included and making sure events were inclusive. And basically, I moved out of California and my job couldn't come with me. And so then I was like, I'll just start my own business. How hard can that be? It is very hard. Definitely overlooked that. But now I'm an inclusion specialist for schools or families or nonprofits, whoever need any sort of support. And I have been really loving it.
So can you tell us a little bit about what an inclusion specialist is and what your role might be?
Yes. So one of the big things about inclusion is that it really looks different on everybody. And that is pretty much what my service is as well, because it's going to look different on every school or family or organization that I work with. But it does have a lot of like one-on-one coaching and me giving any sort of resources that they may need. Usually, a lot, I mean, it is more viewed as coaching. I will come on to campuses and like observe and help and do it that way too. But I'm not a I'm not a member of their community. Like I am not there every day being I'm not in all the staff meetings. I'm just not experiencing it the way that they are. But being a specialist in inclusion, I can come in and kind of help them with their mindsets, with their culture, like, and helping them get to a more inclusive way of thinking when like adapting things for all learners. Um, and it definitely looks different at every school. I've gone to some schools that are, all students are in general ed classrooms, and I've kind of helped with the barriers that are still happening there. And it is usually more of like just having one-on-one conversations with some staff and being like, well, why is that a problem? And kind of just getting them to like rethink some of their things. And then I've also worked at schools that have all the students with disabilities in special education classrooms and talking to the school as a whole of like why it's so important to, keep increasing our time in the general ed setting and like how just ways to do that. And I also do a lot of like virtual trainings that have seemed to be really helpful for schools where they don't have like the time to have like this all day workshop. And so I will like do these videos where I just like break things down and it's usually 30 minutes and then they can kind of watch it whenever they want. And that has also been really helpful.
Awesome. And I think that's how I found your content actually because my son has high support needs. And I found your tips so practical always on Instagram. I'm going to link your Instagram in the show notes. Everybody should definitely check out your Instagram because, like I said, I have found so much help there. But you were
Thank
talking a
you.
little bit about mindset. Can you elaborate? Because I think a lot of us listening maybe don't have the firsthand experience or the professional experience. So, can you talk a little bit about some misconceptions there might be in schools or in other environments around accessibility and inclusivity? Because until I was, in the thick of it myself, I really didn't understand it. So, can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that?
That is actually a huge thing that I talk about a lot is that a lot of people don't think about disability until they either have a family member with a disability or maybe they eventually get a disability. Like, so it is something that I try so hard to say, like talk to your kids about it now. Like you don't have to have a disability to talk about it. And and also, yeah, so working on that mindset of, having a disability does not mean that you're less of a person. And we all are a part of our community. We all should be able to access it, and everything's going to look different. And I think that is just, and I do think that's like really where we are all going, like the new generation of like just people being way more open about people's differences and different ways of communicating and people's boundaries and their needs and like sensory and what do you call it when you like sensitivity? There it is. Sensory sensitivity. So I do feel like it's really just like having that conversation with people of being like it is okay that we are going to be communicating differently, behaving differently, but we all still really want that human connection. And I mean, I've started talking a lot about all those books that like talk about, how can we be happy, like the Happiness Project, or I don't know. I feel like there's so many documentaries about like, how can I make sure that I'm a happy person? And every single one of them at one point we'll talk about how important a community is or those relationships with people. And it doesn't need to be like we get along with everybody because that's not going to happen. But understanding that, like, just because someone has a disability doesn't mean that they don't also want to be a part of their community. But yeah, that mindset shift is really just having a lot of conversations with people and like hearing where they're coming from, like why they're what the biases they have and why they have them. Because it usually just takes having a conversation. I've had people tell me they're like, oh well, if that's what inclusion is, then I'm okay with it. I'm like, cool, well, that's what inclusion is. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's actually what inspired me to reach out to you in the first place because I knew that you typically worked with families and schools, but we have a lot of the same misconceptions in the indoor play business community. And I felt like we could really translate this conversation well to that sense because, one of the biggest misconceptions and one of the biggest, I guess, objections that I hear in my community when I ask people, how they're thinking about inclusivity and accessibility in their spaces, well, our space isn't geared towards people with disabilities, or you have to completely design a space 100% around people with disabilities in order to be inclusive. And I know now that that isn't accurate. So I thought that this would be a great kind of conversation to
Yeah.
have. So if we maybe are struggling with that mindset, or just if we've never invested in disability training or anything like that, can you tell us a little bit about some first steps we might be able to take as business owners if we want to start shifting our mindset and learning more how we can be more inclusive without having to, necessarily design an entire space that is only centered around people with disabilities?
Yes. So I love this question because I think a huge misconception about like an inclusive playground or just any inclusive area is that every single person will be able to access every single thing, because that is impossible to do. So that is definitely not what an inclusive playground would look like, but what, or an inclusive play area would look like. But being able for, I mean, anybody with like a wheelchair or a walking aid, being able to like access the area and having ramps. I mean, I'm pretty sure on Amazon you can buy those ramps. Even if you have like one step going into your area, you can like buy a ramp, like a portable ramp, and making sure things are just like big enough for people to get through. And again, that could be beneficial for, I mean, even parents who might be using wheelchairs, or like grandparents who might be using canes or walkers. I mean, this is so, and people with strollers. I mean, this is so beneficial for so many people. And then I also think a lot of it is around like sensory needs. And I've started seeing a lot more in public indoor places where people have like a sensory bin of like headphones that they could put on, fidgets, making or giving time of like sensory hour play time, which I think is also really great, of saying that like, we're going to have less people, like reserving a spot and like kind of seeing the need of the community of who wants that. I feel like those are just like really, and like just kind of being aware, like if there's a child who is in a wheelchair, like what would they be able to access at their eye level? But I do feel like indoor play areas I've been really impressed so far with all the ones that I've been going to with my two children. I've been really impressed that, though I feel like those things have been happening at every one, where there's a way for kids to get in. Oh, and then feeling safe inside. There's been like a lot of baby gates or just like someone standing at the exit, which I think has also been just so nice, especially for parents who might have a kid who likes to leave an area suddenly without letting anyone know. Because I know not all playgrounds are like gated in. So it is really nice that an indoor playground has that like opportunity to be like a safer area for them.
Absolutely. And something that I hear a lot as well is, well, we don't have the space, or, our space is too small to accommodate wheelchairs or something like that. But, just about a year after we opened our space, we invested in a large amount of wall toys, and it didn't require any additional space. It actually opened our space up because more people were, not huddled in our playhouses. They were along the perimeter of our space, because even though we purchased them to be more accessible because they were at wheelchair height, everybody loved them. Everybody played with them, and it benefited everybody. So I just wanted to mention that as well, because it doesn't
Yes.
always have to be something big or huge or spacious that improves your accessibility.
Yes, I absolutely love those. The wall, all of them. Oh my gosh, they're so fun. And I think that's like a great thing to even just mention with accessibility, that like, people feel very like it's only for this one kid, but it's like, no, so many other people could use it and might really benefit from it.
Yeah,
So
we would
yeah,
see parents playing with the wall toys constantly, even because they didn't want to
yeah.
necessarily go in the playhouse. They're just kind of hanging out at the wall, and then I would catch the parents doing, the little puzzles and things like that. So it truly did benefit everybody, and we were
That
so
makes me
happy
think
that
of
we did that.
that makes me think of kinetic sand, just like how amazing that that texture is. I feel like
Absolutely.
parents have started liking it more than the kids sometimes. Like the kids will run away and parents are like, "What? Come on. This area is so nice."
Yes. And, when we were designing our space, that's one of the things I wish I would have thought about prior, is creating accessible elements that were more geared towards, that were meant for everybody, that everybody could enjoy. But I just didn't have the forethought, I didn't have the training. So if somebody is wanting to get that advanced knowledge and things like that, are there any resources that you recommend so that we could learn about more, inclusive design elements or even universal design? Do you have any favorites?
I mean, really, I would say looking in your community first for organizations that do this. I feel like a lot of it is like private companies just trying to get the word out there. I mean, I do know some organizations like in Maryland, there's the Maryland Coalition, MCIE. I'm not quite sure what the whole acronym stands for, but I know that like they do a lot of training on inclusive education is probably the IE. And I know that like, I mean, there's like really specific ones. I know there's a lot of deaf blind state projects all over, but I mean, I would really just like do a Google search for like your state and then inclusion or like inclusive playgrounds. There's also there's also the Connected Parent, and they are, I think it's connectedparent.org, and it's all of America, and people can put down places that are accessible in their area. So anyone can like go on and be like, I live in Portland, Oregon, like what is wheelchair accessible? And it should give you like a list of places that work. And if you know a company that isn't on there, then you can add it, which is also just a really great tool in general. But yeah, I mean, and then also I'm in a nonprofit called the Recess Project, and we've been working a lot on making recess inclusive. But we have had just a lot of people reaching out of like, well, how do we make it inclusive? And so we've been working with people on like, what makes a place inclusive? How can we help in like any sort of way? And yeah,
So,
I
yeah, so kind of above and beyond the play equipment, because I know that's obviously one of the biggest design elements. Are there any other things that we should be thinking about to be more inclusive, like signs, books, classes, or things like that?
I mean, I definitely think when you say signs, do you mean the ones that are like you can point to the signs and they're like picture icons like you're to communicate?
Yeah, just if there's anything that we could be thinking about as business owners, something that's, I guess what I was getting at is something that's less of an investment in terms of space and
Yeah.
dollars than equipment that can make our space more inclusive, especially because a lot of the people listening will have already opened their space. So they have a limited ability to, completely do an overhaul. But, as a
Yeah.
parent of a child with high support needs, even seeing those little changes, those little communication aids has been really helpful. So, do you have any
Yes.
examples of that?
Yes, I know. I'm pretty sure her name is like the alternate way to pre-K. She had a big poster that she had made for her school that was like a big sign, a communication board that they put up at recess, and I'm pretty sure she sells it for I'm pretty sure it's pretty cheap because she's like selling you just the design and then you have to print it out yourself. But I do think that that's like a pretty easy way to like add something, and it could even just be like kind of a part of conversation, like even because if a child is using a device that is like helping them communicate, they're probably not going to come and be like having a full conversation on there, but it definitely just like raises awareness and gets people talking about it. And then I mean it could be kind of like a shared moment of communication with someone who might be communicating differently. I always love when I see signs of finger spelling, like American Sign Language. I know Braille is harder because it's really expensive to put Braille anywhere, but just again, having things like that really just like raise awareness and get people to talk about it and think about it. If your indoor play area does have books, I think books are and there are so many great inclusive books out there now that just like have the disability representation, even if they're not even talking about disability. But there are also a lot of great books that do talk about disability. And I have like I made a blog post once that has like all of the inclusive books that we have in our house, which probably needs to be updated. But there are so many great books out there to add. You said sign books. What was the third one you said?
I think I said classes.
Classes. Yeah, I mean, if people are interested, I am very happy to make a virtual class for people. Would love to like connect with more people who are trying to build an inclusive world. And I feel like we could work on that together because you are like very much in the thick of it of helping indoor playgrounds. And I think indoor playgrounds are just so amazing, especially now that I live in Washington. It rains here a lot, so it's really nice to have these options like go inside and play. And then having it be inclusive, I think is so important.
Absolutely. And I love that all of these are ways to, again, make a space more inclusive with very little investment, very little change in your physical space because, again, we have limited ability to do that once we're already opened. But hopefully, after hearing this, if somebody is in the pre-planning phases, they do take that into heavy consideration for the design element. But one other thing I wanted to ask, because this is also something that we did, again, shamefully about a year in, is we really started training our staff on accessibility and inclusivity, using the right languages, making people feel included. If somebody is, having a sensory sensitivity or something like that, here's what you can do. Do you generally recommend that people have their staff trained on this type of thing?
Oh, definitely. I think that is so important. And I think even just understanding a very basic, well, having a very basic understanding of child development, I think is so important for typical or atypically developing children. Just in general, understanding how kids' brains are working all the time is so important because I mean, and especially in like an indoor playground area, you are going to see behaviors from all children. And being able to best support the parent in that time, I think is so important. And yeah, you said language. I think that is so important to have all of the staff understand, like, you are talking to all kids the same. Like, you should not be talking to the children that you can see, like, don't have a disability like in one way, and then if you see a child with a disability, like bringing in the baby talk, like it should be. And I know like when you talk to kids, people do kind of have like a kid talk, but it happens too often that people with disabilities get like this huge like talking down to baby talk voice and that is definitely something that needs to be like talked about in training just in general. But yeah, I think a training, especially when you're working around kids, to have that basic understanding is so important.
And I love that you mentioned about reaching out to local organizations because sometimes, I love a virtual class. It's what I do 100% of the time. But sometimes it's nice to have somebody come into your physical space, identify any points that might be an issue for people, role play with staff members because things like tone of voice and inflection and things like that, it's hard to master in a virtual setting. So I love having a combination of virtual training resources and in-person training from whatever nonprofit resources are available to you to kind of get that holistic education.
Yeah, yeah. And I really do feel like there's a lot of people all over doing this work. Sometimes they show up on Google, sometimes they don't. It's hard to understand how Google works sometimes now that now that I'm the business owner trying to get like my SEO or whatever it is all out there. But I mean, social media has been a huge, I feel, and like Facebook groups, I feel like has been a huge thing that like going on there and finding inclusive educators or organizations that do trainings like all over. So I do feel like they're out there.
Yeah, and what I've been doing as well, if there's an organization or a play space that's doing something really well, I'll just reach out to them and say, as long as we're not a direct competitor, like for example, we have a nonprofit children's museum in our area, and I reached out to them. It took a couple times because they're a very large organization, but I said, hey, can you refer me to somebody who, helped consult on your design because I absolutely love all of these aspects. And they gave me a name and number that I still, we still have a great connection. So it always helps to try to make those personal connections if there's somebody out there who's doing what you want to do in a really, in a way that you admire.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, that what a great example of being a community and all trying to work together for such a good goal.
Yeah, so you mentioned, getting in Facebook groups and asking your community and things like that. And I think that is a point that is so important. So, do you have any recommendations for business owners when it comes to engaging with the different communities in their area? So, for example, if they want to host sensory friendly hours, or if they want to host a class that's more inclusive, or if they want to adapt a current class they have or a summer camp or something like that to make it more inclusive. Do you have any recommendations for business owners on who to reach out to in their community, how to engage with their community and become a part of the conversation?
Yeah, I would definitely. I mean, really just like your city and state should be bringing up a bunch of accounts. So I know like where I live, I mean everywhere that I've lived, they always have like, you know, Vancouver food or whatever. And it's like that, every city is like trying to get, restaurants going and, tourists over. And I feel like getting in connection with these groups will then start showing you to people who like live in your community. And I think that is really important when we first moved, because I started my account when I was living in Northern California, and I have moved multiple times before being here in Washington. And I've still, when I moved here, I mean, our phones, like it knows where I'm living, but I was very quickly being connected to other organizations that were just really beneficial. I mean, I started getting connected to groups that were like, oh, like I'm a massage therapist. I want to make sure that my place is inclusive for people. Like, how do I do that? I befriended like a small bookstore, and they started having like sensory friendly like Easter bunny visits. I have an indoor playground very close to me. And again, we connected, and this was all through social media of like, having your location on, of like, so people, and like tagging your location, especially if you're a small business, you should always be like tagging your location so people know where you are. And then finding groups. I mean, on Facebook, I'm in groups that any like educational Vancouver groups I'm in. I'm even in like mom and parent groups, as I'm a mom and a parent, but I'm also wanting to help moms and parents and dads. So, I mean, really just find it's kind of like one of those vulnerable things of just like putting yourself out there, of being like, hey, I'm in the community. Like, how can I help you? And yeah, I mean, I do feel like there is a lot of activity. It's just sometimes it's hard to like find the connections, but they're definitely out there. I mean, social media is like this huge free resource that can be very positive at times.
Absolutely. And I found that when I do, engage with those types of communities, like for example, our area has several parenting groups, and they have kind of spin-off groups for parents of children with autism and some other disabilities. And especially when a business comes in and wants to help, they're so free and generous with suggestions and information and resources. So I
Yes.
love those types of resources. And a lot of people think, well, I can't promote my business inside of Facebook groups. But a lot of times, if you're just asking questions, they kind of let you skirt around those rules a little bit. Of course, if you're being authentic. But
Yeah.
I've gotten some of the best suggestions. That's actually where we got our wall toy suggestions, was from just engaging in a parenting group that was local to me, because it was
That's
something that I would
great.
have loved to incorporate from the beginning. It just, when you're opening a brick and mortar business, you kind of suffer from decision fatigue, and there's so many things you have
Yeah.
to do. It's hard to think of everything. So having those communities, especially if you start reaching out to them sooner rather than later, I think can help you make sure that
Yeah.
no stone is left unturned. So I think that's a really good point, is to just put yourself out there early and often, even if it feels, you know, vulnerable or strange to do so.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, what inclusion is to me is that you're getting to be a part of like your chosen community. And when you are opening a business for your community, don't you want to make sure that your community can access it? And how else are you going to know unless you like ask them basically what they want? And yeah, everything you said, I feel like is just such a great tool that every small business should do, of asking their community what they want, to really just be inclusive and accessible for everyone.
Yeah, and one thing, I got another question from my community that I get pretty often is, or really, I guess, a fear that I hear a lot, is a lot of businesses will say, well, I've reached out for feedback. I've had people come in and look at my design. I feel like I'm inclusive. I feel like I did a good job, but they're afraid to market themselves as inclusive or as catered to people with disabilities, because they're afraid of alienating people or pigeonholing themselves. So when you are, I guess, to put yourself in, your shoes, if you are navigating a business's website or things like that, are there any words or phrases or anything like that that you like to see or look for when you're looking for an inclusive space? Because I think, again, a lot of people have this fear around pigeonholing themselves, but I think that just by choosing the correct language, we can make sure that people feel safe and accepted without feeling like it's only for a certain segment of the population.
Yeah. Wow, that is a really great question. I mean, I definitely think saying that something is accessible is really good marketing because I feel like again, accessibility is very important for like, you know, so many more people than like just the one kid you might be thinking about who might use a wheelchair. But saying that something is like wheelchair accessible, I think is I think I feel like wheelchair accessible, like sensory friendly options are probably my two biggest things that I would say people look for because those are kind of like the two areas of disability that I really feel like get like that's what's keeping people from going somewhere. So when those two things are being met, and I mean, even saying that you have an inclusive playground or an inclusive area, I think that also just means so much more than like just the playground, but you're also saying that like like everyone's welcomed here. Like this is an inclusive setting. Like even if you say that like staff are trained to work with all kids, like I think that is all really important because, and I guess what I'm having a hard time saying an exact answer because, of course, everyone's going to be different. Like, I wouldn't say like this is for kids with and without disabilities because I think that would be like too much. But being able to say that like this is just like an accessible play area for everyone to have fun. I mean, again, it really depends on like what kind of groups are more seen in your community. I do know that sometimes there are certain disabilities that like they start figuring out like where all their people are, or like, especially for like people who might be deaf or blind, there are like schools for the deaf and schools for the blind. So I know a lot of families like will move to those areas. And if they like live in an area with a bunch of stairs and hills and they use a wheelchair, they're probably going to move into a place that doesn't have a bunch of hills. So kind of just being aware of who's in your community, I think is important when going about it. But yeah, but saying that your staff is trained, I think that's also like a huge selling point that a parent can come in and not have to think like they now have to teach everyone about how to like talk to their kid again. Because I think a lot of pressure falls onto the parent of like, how can we best support your kid? And they're like, I don't know. They might get to a point where they're just tired and they're like, I don't know, can they just play? Like, can we just be here and like, be a kid kind of thing? I feel like I definitely rambled there. But I do feel like this is a very like it depending on your space, what you want to offer, what the goal is, will also be changing the language.
Yeah, and I love what you mentioned about doing research about who is in your community because we have a lot of those schools in our area. My son actually goes to a school for children with hearing and speech issues, and I know that many businesses have come to that school as a resource and asked parents for feedback on certain things. So you can just add the language on your website or the language in your class offerings to your list of things to ask feedback on. What kind of things do you look for? What are your buzzwords as you're scanning the website? What
Yeah.
makes you feel safe? What makes you feel like, yes, I can book a party here, or yes, this would be a great space for us to go to. I know for me, one of the things that I always look for is clear pictures of the play area or a video tour so I can really get a good sense of where everything is, if it's fenced in or if it's enclosed.
Yeah.
If there's really strict rules around, different sections having only certain age groups and things like that. Those are things that I always look for. But again, as a business owner, I would have never thought of that until I was actually in it as a parent. So, if you're going through all of the trouble of asking for feedback on your design, I guess you might as well ask for feedback on what they want to see on the website and how we can help them make those decisions about whether or not a space is right for them. And because again, those are things that cost very little to produce. I filmed a video tour of our space on my phone and we got so much positive feedback about it. That's actually one of the things that kind of launched my YouTube channel is people just wanted to see, I see there's pictures on your website, but I can't really get a good feel of how big the space is or, how things relate to one another. And it was something that I could implement in less than a day. So I love your idea of kind of just, again, researching who's out there in your community, what organizations there are, and making this a part of the conversation as well, in addition to design.
Yeah, and I think having a place for feedback is also really important if it's on your website or in person. And I think just trying not to take any sort of like comments too personally. And I know that's like a personality thing. I know I definitely take things too personally, but I still, it needs to be said so I can like reflect on it and then figure out how I'm going to make those changes. Because again, I mean, it could be something that we just don't even think about because that's not something that we have to think about. I mean, I recently, well, this was not recently, but I had a story where I like had a certain filter on to basically hide looking so tired. And someone responded saying that they had low vision and the filter was so hard on their eyes that it was giving them a headache. And at first I was like, offended. I was like, oh man, like I don't know, close your eyes. Like I was saying things that like I would have never, I don't really truly believe, but it was like, you kind of, it's like hard not to put up your walls of like, I'm just trying to help. But then you start, you reflect on it and you're like, okay, obviously I can use a different filter. Like I want you to access this information too. It's such an easy switch. So just like really being open and available to having those conversations and like, figuring out how to make a change that can help everybody is so important. Because yeah, I mean, we're all learning. That's the whole point. Is that nothing's going to come out and be perfect. And so there's
I love that example of a small change, and I completely empathize. I get the same way. People always comment about like I have a Western New York accent, and like that's less of an easy change to make. But it actually made me, because I can speak really quickly sometimes, it made me host my videos on a different hosting platform so that people can slow it down, speed it up. So I had to do something very similar.
yeah,
I can't always change the way I speak, but I can give them a little bit more control. I put subtitles on. So I
that's
completely
great.
relate to that. But at first I was like, they're making fun of my voice. I don't want to be receptive to that. Like, no. And then I was
Yeah.
like, well, I guess I could. And like you said, it benefits
Yes.
everybody, whether they, have hearing needs or if they need it for accessibility reasons or if they just can't understand the way I pronounce certain words. I've gotten great feedback even from people who don't mind my voice because they're clearly listening to this podcast. But I love that. I love that example and just again changing your mindset around being more open to that feedback because oftentimes as business owners, our businesses can feel like extensions of ourselves. So if somebody has
Yeah.
negative feedback, like you said, it's very difficult not to take it personally, especially when it's a brick and mortar space because you've
Yeah.
put your literal blood, sweat, and tears into building it and it was so expensive. And, I completely get that. But just that small
Yeah.
mindset shift of knowing that, yes, we can't please everyone and we can't make every single thing in our space 100% accessible, but we can be open to feedback and we can be good listeners as business owner. I think that's something that's so important to keep in mind.
Yes, I totally agree. And I mean, it's hard not to take things personally when it is a personal project for you. But yeah, it's important to rethink things all the time. I mean, I talk a lot about how I used to say nonverbal and now I say non-speaking, unless I'm talking about nonverbal communication. But if I'm talking about a person, I'll say that they're like non-speaking because that is what the non-speaking community wants us to say. I remember when I first learned the term differently abled, I thought that was such a cool, I was like, oh, I love that. And then I found out the disability community was like, no, we hate that. And I'm like, okay, noted, not going to say it anymore. Like, it's just, things are allowed to change and we are allowed to like, learn from that and like make the change that we need to make.
Absolutely. And there was an example, I don't want to get too off track before we wrap up the conversation, but there was an instance where somebody had some feedback and it was negative, but it was constructive. And they wrote it in the form of a Google review. And this was very early on in my business ownership days where I was still fresh out of opening. I was deeply personally connected to my business. My business and my identity were one. So I took it very personally. And I reached out to them and I said, we were there in person. Couldn't you have just brought this up to us in person? And they said, well, actually I have, this anxiety disorder. I also struggle with speech. English is my second language. And I tried to bring it up a couple times, and actually you weren't very receptive because, for whatever reason, there was all of these reasons
Yeah.
why they felt like leaving that review was the only avenue for their feedback to be heard in an effective way. And it completely changed the way I thought about it. So, as you were kind of bringing up before, we added different ways for people to leave feedback that weren't necessarily public because it just never occurred to me that somebody couldn't or didn't feel comfortable bringing something up in person, because I felt I was pretty receptive to feedback. But if I'm busy, or if, I have a kid strapped to my back, or, if I'm, heads down working on something, I could completely see how somebody might be intimidated, or if English isn't their first language, or if I think this person also had some speech issues. I immediately was like, okay, I'm going to put a notepad. I'm going to put this feedback box. I'm going to put something on our website. But again, my first reaction was to be defensive. And ever since then, I completely changed how, not only how we receive feedback logistically, but just how I accept it as a person. So I
Yeah.
think those are really great examples.
That's such a great story. That is like such a great way that you learned and like made changes and but not like huge changes. Those were all like very simple changes that like made your business even better.
Yeah, and I think we make the mistake oftentimes of assuming people have ill intent when they leave a negative review. And it wasn't a 1 star, I think it was like 2 or 3 stars or something like that. But I immediately assumed they were trying to destroy my business, and they weren't. They were just trying to get their feedback across. And like I said, their criticism was constructive. It was not inaccurate.
Yeah.
I completely forget what it was about because that wasn't really the point, but I just remember it being constructive. But immediately I was like, oh, this person clearly has the intent to destroy my business because they posted this publicly. So I think not assuming people's intent, always
Yes.
assuming the best and following up for more information. I'm so thankful to this day that I didn't respond publicly and say, gosh, how dare you, or something like that. I emailed them personally and I just said, next time I would appreciate just bringing it up in person. And when they came back with that information, it completely, like I said, changed my entire way of thinking. So I know we got off track a little bit, but I think that was a really great conversation because, again, a lot of people who are newer in the business ownership journey, they don't understand yet what this looks like in practice. Again, they hear the word accessible and they just think wheelchair accessible or sensory friendly, and they don't think about all of the different ways disabilities can
Hmm.
impact people, whether that's anxiety or, other speech disorders or, invisible disabilities. So I think just giving those couple examples are great for people to kind of further wrap their heads around what, like we said at the beginning, what inclusivity really means.
Yeah. Yeah. And invisible disabilities, that is a huge one that I feel like a lot of people kind of mask or like just try not, do whatever they can to like kind of get out of a situation that they don't feel comfortable in. And I think it's so important, again, for that staff training of like, not everyone's going to respond the same way that you want them to, or that you're going to respond, that having those different avenues is just so important.
Yeah, and just giving, because I think you were kind of mentioning at the beginning, you work with parents to kind of advocate for their children and you help empower them to feel like they can be a vocal advocate. I think we as business owners, as brick and mortar business owners, can do more to help parents feel safe to be that advocate, whether it's a review card or something that doesn't have to be put publicly online, just giving them different avenues to give that feedback so that they can feel like they're able to advocate and just feel like there's that two-way communication and feel like they're part of the community and that you're receptive to that feedback and you're not going to jump on the defensive. I just think creating that
Yeah.
expectation and that sort of relationship is so important, not just to be more inclusive, but just to be a better business owner. So I'm glad that we
Yeah.
kind of ended on that. I think that was a really positive takeaway. But if we are interested in learning more about inclusion and accessibility, where can we best connect with you?
Yeah, so I would say Instagram is probably the best way to get the snippets of information. And my name is Inclusion Starts Now. But that is on everything, on YouTube, on Facebook, on TikTok, on whatever there is. And if you want to personally, I mean, you can message me on there. A lot of people do, or you can email me. It's Kayla at inclusionstartsnow.com. So pretty much if you type in inclusion starts now, like I should pop up somewhere. And it's only me. But I love the conversations. I love, oh, and I have a website. Again, it's inclusionstartsnow.com. But everywhere there are ways to connect with me, and I usually respond pretty quickly because I don't know, I'm home, I'm here.
And you're very passionate about what you do, and it's so clear.
Yes.
It's so clear in your content that you care and that you're authentic. And it's, I follow so many different creators in this space, and I just felt so drawn to you. So I'm going to link everything in the show notes of this episode or in the video description if you're watching. But I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time and energy and expertise today.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so happy we have gotten to connect over social media. See, look at that. Another great connection.
All right. Well, thank you. All right, that wraps up my conversation with Kayla Coburn of Inclusion Starts Now. As I mentioned at the beginning, I've linked Kayla's social media accounts and website in the video description, but also feel free to ask any questions in the comments if you'd like anything clarified further. All right, I hope you enjoyed this conversation, and I will see you soon. Bye for now.